ASMR stream of reading one of my favorite books, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. My original ASMR video I did kind of as a joke, but since that's my most watched video, I figured I should do another one and see how it goes. So, now let's just start reading and we'll see how far we get tonight. If this does well, if I upload it to YouTube or anything, then I'll probably continue reading, since I'm probably not going to finish the entire book tonight. So let me show you what I got. I've got the Hitchhiker's Guide by Douglas Adams, the ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This has all of his books and everything. But we're just going to start reading through the original Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So just the first book. So I know a lot of people have seen the movie, but don't think that you know exactly what's going to come in the book, because the book and the movie and all the radio shows and everything, they all contradict each other according to this book and Douglas Adams himself. So we're just gonna start reading through it, and hopefully people like this, because I love this book, and hopefully I don't start bursting out in laughter, because that will definitely ruin the ASMR vibe. But let's get going. Alright, so The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Sorry, just finding my chapter. Alright. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded, yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy, and so the problem remained. Lots of people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with the digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they had all made a big mistake in coming from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should have left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying, how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rixmanworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to be nailed to anything. Stupid catastrophe. Sadly, however, before she should get to a phone to tell anybody about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it's the story of that stupid, terrible catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, non-Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard of either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Oolong Kulovid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyways? In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, The Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, for though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed on it in large, friendly letters on its cover. As you can see from the book I'm reading, got "Don't Panic" on it. Nice, large, and friendly. Thanks, person, I appreciate it. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book, begins very simply. It begins with a house. Love you too, internet stranger. Alright, chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise, just on the edge of a village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London, because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in a local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought it was, too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear. As it shone on Arthur's Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothbrush on brush, scrub, shaving mirror pointed at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment, it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped on to the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pup, he thought. Oh dear, the pup. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He had been telling people about it in great lengths. He rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and laying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Proser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though, he didn't know it. He was also a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Proser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness and the tum and predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today, he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur's Dent got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first." "I'm afraid you're gonna have to accept it," Mr. Proser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it round the top of his head. "This bypass has got to be built. It's going to be built." "First I've heard of it," said Arthur. "Why's it got to be built?" Mr. Proser shook his finger at him for a bit and then stopped and put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses." Bypasses are a device that allows some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there. And what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Proser wanted to be at point D. Point D was anywhere in particular. It wasn't just any convenient point, a very long way from points A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D with axes over the nearest door and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why. He just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, and it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously somebody had been appalling, incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Proser said, "You were quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know." "Appropriate time," hooted Arthur. "Appropriate time. The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my own yesterday. I asked if he had come to clean the windows, and he said no, he'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh no. First, he wiped a couple of windows and charged me a $5. Then he told me. But Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh yes, well, as soon as I heard, I went straight round to see them. Yesterday afternoon, you hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything. But the plans were on display. On display. I had eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the department display. With a flashlight. Ah, well, the lights had probably gone. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you? Yes, said Arthur. Yes, I did. It was on display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet stuck in a disused lavatory, with a sign on the door saying, "Beware of the leopard." A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow on Arthur Dent as he laid propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Proser frowned at it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. I'm sorry, but I happen to like it. You'll like the bypass. Oh, shut up, said Arthur Dent. Shut up and go away and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on and you know it. Mr. Proser, mouth open and closed and a couple of times while his mind was for a moment filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur's Dent's house being consumed with fire and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruins with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Proser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment and then pulled himself together. Mr. Dent, he said. Hello. Yes, said Arthur. Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I let it roll straight over you? How much? Said Arthur. None at all, said Mr. Proser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain had been filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen, all shouting at him. Sorry, just get a quick sip of water. Alright. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from the Guildford as he usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never, ever suspected this. This friend of his had first arrived on the planet Earth some 15 years ago, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society. With, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder through, though, because he had skimped a bit on his preparatory research. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect. As being nicely inconspicuous, he was not conspicuously tall. His features were striking but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish and brushed backwards from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backward from his nose. There was something very slightly odd about him. But it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him any length of time, your eyes began involuntary wander on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as eccentric, but a harmless one, an unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gate crash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicist he could find until he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment and relax and grin. Oh, just looking for flying saucers, he would joke, and everyone would laugh and ask what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. Green ones, he would reply, with a wicked grin, laugh wildly for this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddle in a corner with some girl, and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly, the color of flying saucers didn't matter that much really. Thereafter, staggering semi-paralytic down at the night streets, he was often asked passing policemen if they knew the way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby. I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied on these occasions. The fact what he was really looking for when he stared distractingly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was that green was the traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice trading scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate for any flying saucer that would arrive soon, because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as the Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon, because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts for them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime, life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Proser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploy, such as the for the public good talk, or the march of progress talk, the they knocked my house down once, you know, never looked back talk, and various other casualties and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up, squinting into the sun, was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford, hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" explained Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of, because they'll knock my house down if I don't. But other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds, Ford seemed to ignore him and stared fixingly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car, then suddenly squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now, we'll go to the pub in the village." He looked to the sky again, nervous and expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Proser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it while you're awake," listen to me. I appreciate that. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing that you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you in the saloon bar of the house and groom. But why? Because you're gonna need a very stiff drink. Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game Ford learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Madronite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth's game called Indie Wrestling, and was played like this. Two contestants would sit at either side of a table with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of Jenks spirit, and immortalized in the ancient Orion mining song, "Oh, don't give me none more of that old Jenks spirit. No, don't you give me none more of that old Jenks spirit, for my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old Jenks spirit?" Each of the two contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again and again. Sounds like a fun drinking game. We should give it a go sometime. Once you start to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of Jenks spirit is to depress the telepsychic power. As soon as the predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would then have to perform a forfeit, which is usually obscenely biological. Ford usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the house and groom after all. "But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Proser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock your house down. Yes, he wants to build, and he can't because you're lying in front of this bulldozer. Yes, and I'm sure we could come to some arrangement," said Ford. "Excuse me," he shouted. Mr. Proser, who was arguing with a spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. "Yes, hello," he called. "Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet?" "Can we, for the moment," called Ford, "assume that he hasn't?" "Well," sighed Mr. Proser, "and can we assume," said Ford, "that he's going to be staying here all day?" So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing. Could be. Well, if you're assigned to do that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you? "What? You don't," said Ford patiently, "actually need him here?" Mr. Proser thought about this. "Well, not as such," he said. "Not exactly need." Mr. Proser was worried. He thought that one of them was making a lot of sense. Ford said, "So, if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Proser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. Fudge, yes, that's very kind. He frowned, then smiled, then tried to do both at once. Failed, grasped hold of his fur hat and rolled it fitfully round the top of his head. He could only assume he had just won. So, continued Ford Prefect, if you would just like to come here and lay down. What? Mr. Proser said. I'm sorry, said Ford. Perhaps I haven't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lay in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them from driving over Mr. Dent's house, will there? What? Said Mr. Proser again. It's very simple, said Ford. It's very simple, said Ford. My client, Mr. Dent, says that he'll stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and talk and take over from him. What are you talking about, said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. You want me, said Proser, spelling out his new thought to himself, to come and lie there. Yes. In front of the bulldozers. Yes. In the mud. In, as you say, the mud. As soon as Mr. Proser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight lifted itself off his shoulders. This was more like the world he knew, he sighed. In return for which you would take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub. That's it, said Mr. Ford. That's it exactly. Mr. Proser took a few nervous steps forward and then stopped. Promise, he said. Promise, said Ford. He turned to Arthur. Come on, he said to him. Get up and let the man lay down. Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Proser, who sadly, awkwardly sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was, and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself round his bottom, and his arms oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely, and no sneaky knocking Mr. Dent's house down while he's away, all right. The mere thought, growled Mr. Proser, hadn't even begun to speculate. He continued, settling himself back about the merest possibility of crossing my mind. He saw the boatholders' driver's union representative and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he was not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far more certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noise, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Proser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids, bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in the mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliation, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day. Ford Perfect knew it didn't matter a pair of dingoes' kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not. Arthur remained very worried. But can we trust him, he said. Myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth, said Ford. Oh yes, said Arthur, and how far is that? About 12 minutes away, said Ford. Come on, I need a drink. Alright, so that's the end of chapter 1. So now for chapter 2. Here's what the Encyclopedia Galactica has to also notes an extoc in inex sorry, misspeaking, and also notes its intoxicating effect on certain carbon-based life forms. The Hitchhiker's Guide of the Galaxy also mentions alcohol. It says that the best drink in existence is the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. It says the effect of drinking a Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster is like having your brain smashed out by a slice of lemon wrapped around a large gold brick. The guide also tells you on which planets the best Pan-Galactic Gargle Blasters are mixed, how much you can expect to pay for one, and what voluntary organizations exist to help you rehabilitate afterward. The guide even tells you how you can mix one yourself. Take the juice from one bottle of the old jank spirit, it says. Pour into it 1 measure of water from the sea of Santigrinus 5. Oh, that Santigrinian water, it says. Oh, those Santigrinian fish. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturian Megagin to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced, or the benzene is lost. Allow 4 liters of Philalian marsh gas to bubble through it, in memory of all those happy hypers who have died of pleasure in the marshes of Philea. Over the back of a silver spoon float a measure of Qualactian hypermint extract, redolent of all the yeady odors of the dark quatilian zones, subtle, sweet, and mystic. Drop in the tooth of an Alligarian sun tiger, watch it dissolve, spreading the fires of the Allogian sun deep into the heart of the drink. Sprinkle Zemphor, add an olive, drink, but very carefully. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells rather better than the Encyclopedia Galactica. 6 pints of bitter, said Ford, perfect to the barman of the house and groom, and quickly, please, the world's about to end. The barman of the horse and groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out the window. So the barman looked instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh yes, sir, ninth Wessler for it," and started pulling pints. He tried again, going to watch the match this afternoon then. Ford glanced round at him. No point, he said, and looked back out the window. "What's that? Foregone conclusion then, you reckon, sir?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance." No, said Ford. "It's just that the world's about to end." "Oh yes, sir, so you said the barman, looking over his glasses, this time at Arthur. "Lucky escape for Arsenal if it did." Ford looked back at him, genuinely surprised. "No, not really," he said. He frowned. The barman breathed heavily. "There you are, sir, 6 pints," he said. Arthur smiled at him wanly and shrugged again. He turned and smiled wanly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them could understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the 2 men, looked at the 6 pints, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned in stupid, hopeful grin at them. "Get off," said Ford. "They're ours," giving him a look that would have made an Algorian sun tiger get on with what it was doing. He said, "Keep the change." "What, from a fiver?" "Thank you, sir." "You've got 10 minutes left to spend it." The barman decided simply to walk away for a bit. "Ford," said Arthur, "would you please tell me what the hell is going on?" "Drink up," said Ford. "You've got 3 pints to get through." 3 pints, said Arthur, "at lunchtime." The man next to Ford nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, "Time is an illusion. Lunchtime, doubly so." "Very deep," said Arthur. "You should send that in to the Reader's Digest. They've got a page for people like you." "Drink up. Why 3 pints all of a sudden?" "Muscle relaxant. You'll need it." "Muscle relaxant? Muscle relaxant." Arthur stared into his beer. "Did I do anything wrong today?" he said. "Or has the world always been like this, and I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice?" "All right," said Ford. "I'll try to explain. How long have we known each other?" How long? Arthur thought. About 5 years, maybe 6, he said. Most of it seemed to make sense, some kind of sense at the time. "All right," said Ford. "How would you react if I said I'm not from Guildford after all, but from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice?" Arthur shrugged in a so-so sort of way. "I don't know," he said, taking a pull of beer. "Why do you think it's the sort of thing you're likely to say?" Ford gave up. It wasn't really worth bothering at the moment. What with the world being about to end, he just said, "Drink up." He added, perfectly factually, "The world's about to end." Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at them and mind his own business. "This must be Thursday," said Arthur to himself, sinking low over his beer. "I never could get the hang of Thursdays." Sorry, just grabbing another drink. On this particular... this is the beginning of chapter 3. So, just to know where we're at? Okay. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface. On the planet, several somethings, in fact, several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings, huge as office blocks, silent as birds, they soared with ease, basking in electromagnet rays from the star's soul, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something went unnoticed at Goon Hilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Womerah and Jordal Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity, because it's exactly the sort of thing they've been looking for all these years. The only place they registered at all was on a small black device called a sub-etho-sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel, which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung round his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head. For plays he pretended wasn't auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the sub-etho-sensomatic in the scripts, he had an electric thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte, with a couple of flat switches and dials at the end. He also had a device that looked rather like a largest electronic calculator. This had about 100 tiny, flat buttons and a screen about 4 inches square, on which any one of a million pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover is fitted with the words, "Don't Panic," printed in large, friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was in fact the most remarkable of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporation of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were to be printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would be required to carry several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around. Beneath that, in Ford Prefect's satchel, were a few ballpoints, a notepad, and a large bath towel from Marks and Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jalk and Beta. You can lie on it on the bright marble sanded beaches of Saturnius V, inhaling the heady sea vapors. You can sleep under it beneath the stars which shone so redly on the desert world of Kakravoon. Use it to sail a mini raft down the slow, heavy river Muth. Wet it for the use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxic fumes, or evade the gaze of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trull, a mind-boggling, stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal, and of course, you can dry yourself off with it if it still seems clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag, which strag means a non-hitchhiker, discovers a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is in possession of a toothbrush, washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of spring, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen of other items that the hitchhiker might have accidentally lost. With the strag, what the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase that has been passed into hitchhiker slang, as in, "Hey you, sass, that hoppy Ford prefect, there's a frood who really knows where his towel is." Sass means, of course, know, be aware of, met, have sex with. Hoopy means really together guy. Frood means really amazing together guy. So there's all your hitchhiker slang that you're slowly picking up. Alright, nestle quietly on top of the towel. In Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-etho-sensomatic began to wink more quickly, miles above the surface of the planet. The huge yellow somethings began to fan out. A chortle nice, relaxing cup of tea. You got a towel with you, said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked around at him. Why? What? No. Should I have? He had given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. Drink up, he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of rumbling crash from outside filtered through low murmur of the pub, through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer, leaped to his feet. "What's that?" he yelped. "Don't worry," said Ford. "They haven't started yet." "Thank God for that," said Arthur, and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pint. "What?" said Arthur. Suddenly, Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. "My God, they are knocking my house down. What the hell am I doing in the pub, Ford?" "It hardly makes any difference at this age," said Ford. "Let them have their fun." "Fun," yelped Arthur. "Fun." He quickly checked out the window again that they were talking about the same thing. "Damn their fun," he hooted and ran out of the pub furiously, waving a nearly empty glass of beer. He made no friends at the pub at all that lunchtime. "Stop, you vandals! You homewreckers!" bawled Arthur. "You half-crazed Visigoths! Stop, will you?" Ford would have to go after him. Turning quietly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. "There you are, sir," said the barman, slapping the packets in the bar. 28 pence, if you be so kind." Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £5 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it, then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand, because no one on earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. The signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be further than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't that far. So, such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away in the near vicinity of Beetlejuice. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shockingly incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. "Are you serious, sir?" he said in a small whisper, which had the effect of silence in the pub. "You think the world's gonna end?" "Yes," said Ford. "But this afternoon?" "Yes," he said gallingly. "In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate." The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having. But he couldn't believe the sensation he had just had either. "Isn't there anything we can do about it then?" he said. "No, nothing," said Ford, stuffing peanuts into his pockets. Someone in his hushed bar suddenly laughed rancorously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. "I thought," he said, "that if the world was going to end, we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over your head or something." "If you'd like, yes," said Ford. "That's what they told us in the army," said the man, and his eyes began the long trek back to his whiskey. "Will that help?" said the barman. "No," said Ford, and gave him a friendly was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the rancorous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour. It would have probably been a great satisfaction to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice. The barman cleared his throat. You heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downward and move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden, irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians," he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered and whipped and boiled until you've had enough." Ford was running after him very fast, very, very fast. "And then I'll do it again," yelled Arthur, "and when I've finished, I'll take all the little bits and I'll jump on them." Arthur didn't notice that the man was running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Proser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Proser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds. Impossibly huge yellow somethings. "And I'll carry it on, jumping on them," yelled Arthur, still running, "until I get blisters, or I can think of anything even more unpleasant to do." And then Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled and landed on the flat of his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His fingers shot upward. "What the hell is that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was, it raced across the sky in a monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with a mind-boggling noise, and leaped off to the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did the exact same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noises at the noise. All around the world, city streets exploded with people, cars skidding into each other as the noise fell on them, and then rolled off like a tidal wave over the hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flatten everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eyes and rubber bungs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and had known ever since his sub-ethos sensomatic started winking in the dead of night beside his pillow and wakened him. With a start, it was what he had been waiting for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern sitting alone in a small, dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races in all the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to this planet, he thought, didn't it just have to be the Vogons? Apologies, just gotta stay hydrated. Still, he knew what he had to do. As the Vogon's craft screamed through the air above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionlessly in the sky over every nation on the earth. Motionless, they hung, huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still, nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. People of Earth, your attention, please, a voice said, and it was wonderful, wonderfully perfect, quadraphonic sound with distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep. This is the prosthetic Vogon Yelts of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council, the voice continued. As you will no doubt be aware, for the developments of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial express route through your star system, and regrettably, your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. This process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you. The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathered crowds, as if they were iron fillings on a sheet of board and magnet moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again. Desperate, fleeing panic. But there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA again. It said, "There's no point in acting surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years, so you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted across the lands. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky, with easy power. On the underside of each hatchway opened an empty black square. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message back to the Vogon ships to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was annoyed. if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams. Light poured out of the hatchways. I don't know, said the voice on the PA. Apathetic, bloody planet. I've no sympathy at all. It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void. Okay, hey YouTube ASMR viewer, I hope you liked that video. If you did like it, please, I know it's cliche to ask for it, but please give me a like or a comment, subscribe, let me know if you like it. I'm still pretty new to doing ASMR